Next, use adequate contrast. I think all of you know this, but I'll just give you a few more details to make it crystal clear. So for small text, such as 14-point font or smaller, or small icons such as 24 pixels large, the text and icon need to be meeting 4.5 to 1 against the background. So that means 4.5 times darker or lighter than the associated background. And the background can either be if the icon is right on top of the UI background, or maybe it's on top of a button fill. That icon or text needs to meet 4.5 to 1 against whatever background it's on top of. And this also applies to images of text. However, I strongly advise against images of text unless it's absolutely necessary, because a screen reader won't be able to interpret that whatever text is on that image unless you've added alt text, which is honestly more work in the end if it could just be plain text. However, I do understand, if you have like a logo, for example, that's just an image, that is fine. And that technically is exempt from needing to meet contrast ratios and contrast requirements, because it's purely your brand expression. This also applies to purely decorative elements as well. So let's say, you just have like a little flower in the corner of your gardening app or something. That doesn't need to meet contrast per se. And it also doesn't have to have alt text, which we'll get into in a bit. However, you are adding these elements because you want to create delight for people, or maybe once again, you're expressing your brand. So it is best to consider, like, can everyone perceive this content? And do I want everyone to perceive this content? So I would advise that you do meet contrast where possible. So as I mentioned, 4.5 to 1 for small text and icons. But if there's anything larger than that, let's say 18-point font or 14-point font bolds, you can meet 3 to 1. So that means 3 times darker than the background. So I have a question for you all. Whoever is brave wants to type in the chat or unmute. I'm curious if these hearts off to the right need to meet contrast. So there's a super light gray heart on top of a gray background. And then there's a super light gray heart on top of a white background. Does anyone know if they should meet contrast ratios? And if so, like, which contrast ratio? I'm just curious what you all think. And there's no right or wrong answer.
Does it depend on the context?
Good job. Okay, there is a right answer. Yes, it does depend on the context. So as I mentioned, if this is a purely decorative image, technically it doesn't need to meet contrast, although I personally don't understand why you would have this, because I can barely see it right now, right in front of my face. However, let's say, you're liking a video or a photo. If this is not meeting contrast, then users pretty much can't interact with your app and won't even know it's there, or may think it's disabled. So great job. All right, so as you all, continue to think about your brand, I'd recommend checking out the material color tool if you want to expedite the process of checking contrast ratios. There is a custom button towards the top left, and so you can add in your hex codes or just play around with the material color palette as well. There's also some other contrast checkers, which I'll leave in the resources page at the very end. But by WebAIM, there's also tons of Figma contrast plugins. And if you all are curious, Material just came out with Material U. And so on the material.io site, there's an article called The Color System. So if you just search for the color system, material.io, you can learn more about Material U, which leverages dynamic colors. All right, next, use information hierarchy. So this is pretty much a basic interaction design principle, but in order to convey an item's relative importance, you want to keep those items of importance higher up on your UI, and also contextualize related items. And by placing these items earlier in your UI, you ensure that people using assistive technologies can reach these items, can reach them and interact with them more efficiently. And I say this because oftentimes assistive technology uses or moves the user in a linear way, and it moves from the top to bottom, left to right on left to right interfaces, and then it's localized for right to left interfaces. And we call this the focus order. And it's because an assistive technology will actually put a ring, like a focus ring, around whatever element has focus. So it's oftentimes seen as a blue box. Maybe you've clicked on something and all of a sudden a box will appear, but that's the focus ring. And technically speaking, the focus order follows the HTML DOM order. And I know this gets super technical and it took me a really long time to fully learn this, but essentially the DOM order is the structure of the page, ranging from heading hierarchies to the button placements and essentially like the bare bones of the site. And so in order to enable the screen reader to read out the content in the way you intended, it's important for designers to collaborate with engineers in writing out the HTML in the correct order, but also really for designers to annotate the expected experience that you want your users to have. And so, as I mentioned, the focus order should follow the DOM order, and it should start from top to bottom, left to right. So if you have really critical actions, you want to have those higher up in your traversal order. And a designer would annotate this within their design specs. So if you have, your Figma file or Sketch file and you have different components, I would recommend going through them and seeing how long it takes a user to get to that checkout button where they want to add something to their cart. And if it's, a significant amount of steps, maybe that's a poor experience and you should rearrange some less important controls. So here's just an example of how you could annotate for accessibility. I'd recommend looking this up further, but essentially you want to hide any decorative images and let the engineer know that this isn't really important. And we'll get into like how you can make that decision. You also want to call out what is a link, because there's something called ARIA, ARIA labels, which I'll touch upon later. But it gets into the weeds and more technical side, but essentially, if you can't see that there's a link, then the system needs to communicate that this is a link. So everything has a role, an ARIA role, and you add a label to that role. So in this case, this was the brand of the clothing site, I guess, and this was a link. And then you want to have different heading hierarchies. Usually they should cascade in the proper order. This wasn't necessarily, and oftentimes the heading hierarchy will range from heading 1 to 6 and should follow that flow, usually visibly as well. And then similarly, there's an ARIA role for buttons and things like that. So add to cart button. The add to cart would be the label, and then button would be the role. All right, so let's dig into operate. So operable. Can someone properly operate your site and interact with the content? So I've been talking a lot about screen readers, but I'll go a little bit more deeper. But once again, like if you have questions, let me know. I don't want this to be intimidating, and I highly recommend continuing to learn about this. But I've mentioned iOS VoiceOver is one screen reader, and on iOS VoiceOver, a user can enable their rotor, and there's a keyboard shortcut. I think it's Control-Option-U if you're on Mac, but VoiceOver only works on Mac and like iOS, like mobile devices. So essentially perform that shortcut, and then this rotor will appear, and users can efficiently navigate the site based on headings, landmarks, links, and things like that. So that way they don't have to press tab, tab, tab and move from the very top corner all the way to the very bottom corner. And it can be more efficient to jump around. But this goes to show how important heading hierarchies are then. So I just mentioned H1 heading all the way to H6. And hopefully you may be able to see on the screen various headings for this website. So Tom Andrews, which is the writer, is a heading 2 because it's not as important as the main site heading, which is accessibility running NVDA on Mac, which is another screen reader. And it just cascades from there. And that way a user using a screen reader can quickly jump to different sections. But it's critical that these headings are descriptive enough for one to grok the content. You don't want it to just say like heading 1, because that doesn't really mean anything. And that's very similar to adding labels to controls on the page. So if you were working with an engineer on your product, or you just want to gain some experience by writing some specs for your various UI designs, I would recommend considering the accessibility experience, which involves writing ARIA labels. And so as designers, we decide what the label says and work with engineers to determine the control type that best affords this action. So I won't get into the weeds, but I think like if you all are brave, it's not intimidating at all. So hopefully you do this after this talk, but you just turn on your screen reader and then go to any site, literally go to YouTube, Google, whatever, even your personal website, and then just press your tab key. That's all you need to do. You might want to mute the screen reader or just like mute your device first in case like, the sounds are overwhelming. But essentially a little panel in the corner will pop up and you'll see exactly what everything is said. So if you have a hamburger menu, for example, it might show menu button, and that's exactly what this example is showing. And that's how users using a screen reader can comprehend the different elements on your site. In terms of writing the labels, you really want to describe the action without implying an input method. So rather than saying tap to speak, because not everybody can tap, just say voice search. And also you want to be descriptive enough so that users know the action that they're performing. So rather than saying pencil, which I don't think any of us would do, you'd want to say edit instead. And in terms of alternative text, which is used to describe meaningful images only, you want it to be as descriptive as possible, but as concise as possible. This is obviously an auditory experience, and it can be overwhelming when information such as that little flower that I mentioned earlier in the corner is described and every other little butterfly is described. Nobody cares. They don't want to hear that. They want to get to the point and actually interact with your device. So hide decorative images, but in terms of writing critical messages for alt text, I think this is a pretty good example where, on one side, uninformative is just charging phone. Okay, that doesn't really tell me how to charge my phone. But on the other side, it's saying, plug in the cord into the bottom of the phone. And that way users know exactly what action they need to take. All right, so next and last for this section of